It is a Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, September the 15th, 1963. The air is warm and thick, the way it always is in the American South just before autumn arrives. Inside the 16th Street Baptist Church, a group of young girls are in the basement, changing into their choir robes. The sanctuary upstairs is filling with families. Hymn books are open, someone is adjusting the microphone at the pulpit, and then, at exactly 10:22 in the morning, the world splits open. 15 sticks of dynamite, planted beneath the church steps by members of the Ku Klux Klan, tear through the basement wall. The blast is so violent that it punches a hole through the stone. Stained glass windows shatter across the pews, and in the silence that follows, 4 girls are gone. Addie Mae Collins, 14 years old. Cynthia Wesley, 14. Carol Denise McNair, just 11. Across the country, in her home, a woman named Nina Simone hears the news, and something inside her breaks. Not the kind of breaking that makes a person fall apart, but the kind that makes a person dangerous. She will later describe what happened next. She said she went to her garage and tried to build a gun. She gathered the parts. She was going to go find one of the men responsible, and she was going to take him out. She did not care who it was. Her husband stopped her. He told her, "Nina, you cannot kill anyone. You are a musician. Do something with what you have." What she had was a piano, and within the hour, she had written a song that would shake the conscience of a nation. But we will get to that. Because the story of how jazz became the secret weapon of the civil rights movement does not begin in 1963. It begins much further back, in a place where music was not a luxury. It was how people survived. Long before jazz had a name, there was sound. In the cotton fields of the American South, under a sun that showed no mercy, enslaved people sang, not because they were happy, not because their captors allowed it. They sang because it was the one thing that could not be taken from them. The songs they created were layered with meaning. On the surface, a spiritual about crossing the River Jordan might sound like a religious hymn. But underneath, the words carried coded instructions. The river was not metaphorical, it was real. Cross the river, and you might reach the next station on the Underground Railroad. The melody was a map. The rhythm was a pulse of survival. These songs evolved. After emancipation, after the brief promise of Reconstruction was betrayed, after Jim Crow laws locked Black Americans into a system designed to replicate slavery by another name, the music evolved too. In the streets and parlors and churches of New Orleans, something extraordinary began to happen. Brass band traditions that European immigrants had brought to Louisiana collided with African polyrhythms, with the deep emotional well of the blues, with the call and response patterns of the Black church. And out of that collision came something the world had never heard before. In the Treme neighborhood, one of the oldest free Black communities in America, musicians started improvising, not just playing the notes on a page, but talking to each other through their instruments, responding in real time, creating conversations that could not be planned or predicted. They played at funerals, and the tradition that developed tells you everything you need to know about what jazz really is. The march to the cemetery was slow and mournful, a dirge that honored the weight of loss. But on the walk back, something changed. The band would break into something bright and syncopated, something that swung, and the mourners became dancers. Not because they had forgotten their grief, because they were insisting, with their bodies and with the music, that life was still worth celebrating, that death did not get the last word. This was the beginning. This was the DNA of jazz, born not from comfort, but from the insistence that joy and grief could exist in the same breath. The music grew fast in New Orleans. Storyville, the city's official red light district, was full of clubs and dance halls that needed musicians every single night. A young trumpeter named Louis Armstrong learned his craft in those rooms. absorbing everything, developing a sound that was brighter and more expressive than anything anyone had heard. Jelly Roll Morton, a Creole pianist with an ego the size of the Mississippi River, was experimenting with written arrangements that preserved the spontaneous energy of improvisation. King Oliver, Sidney Bechet, Kid Ory. These names might not be household words today, but in the early 1900s they were building the foundation of an art form that would reshape the century. And then the music left home. In 1917, the United States Navy shut down Storyville, and the musicians who had depended on its clubs for work suddenly had nowhere to play. But the real engine of change was something much larger: the Great Migration. Between roughly 1910 and 1970, more than 6 million Black Americans left the rural South. They boarded trains at stations where they had to use separate waiting rooms. They packed their belongings into cars if they had them, walked when they did not. They left behind land their families had worked for generations, land that had been worked under enslavement and then under sharecropping arrangements that were barely distinguishable from enslavement. They left because the South was killing them. Lynchings were commonplace. The Ku Klux Klan operated with near impunity. Economic opportunities were non-existent. Education for Black children was deliberately underfunded and inferior. To stay was to accept a life defined by someone else's hatred. They headed north and west, to Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and above all, New York. The journey itself was an act of courage. Many of them had never been outside their home county. They were leaving everything they knew for a place they had only heard about in letters from relatives who had gone before them, or in the pages of the Chicago Defender, the Black newspaper that actively encouraged migration and published train schedules alongside stories about job opportunities in northern cities. They carried their music with them like something precious, like a family heirloom that could not be left behind. Chicago became a second capital of jazz and blues. The South Side clubs roared with a new electric energy. Maxwell Street was alive with street musicians. Muddy Waters brought the Mississippi Delta blues north and plugged it into an amplifier, creating the foundation for what would become rock and roll. But it was in New York that jazz found its fullest expression. And when these musicians arrived in Harlem, the music found new rooms to fill, and those rooms shook with a sound that was equal parts celebration and defiance. By the 1920s, Harlem was electric. The neighborhood was dense with life, with ambition, with talent that had been suppressed for generations and was now erupting. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were redefining American literature, insisting that Black voices belonged not on the margins but at the center of the nation's story. Painters like Aaron Douglas were reimagining what Black identity could look like on canvas, drawing on African motifs and modernist techniques to create images of power and beauty. And at night, the clubs opened. Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue pulsed with sound. There were more than 125 entertainment venues operating in Harlem at the peak of the Renaissance. Speakeasies, cellars, dance halls, rib joints, theaters, supper clubs. The music poured out of them and into the streets, and you could walk for blocks and never be out of earshot of a saxophone or a piano or a voice soaring above a crowd. The philosopher Alain Locke called this the New Negro Movement, a conscious effort by Black artists and intellectuals to reject the stereotypes and limitations that white America had imposed on them and to create a new vision of what it meant to be Black in America. Locke argued that for generations, the Negro had been more of a formula than a human being in the American mind, something to be argued about, condemned, or patronized. The Harlem Renaissance was an attempt to break that formula, to show the world the full, complex humanity of Black life. And jazz was its beating heart. But here is where the story gets complicated, because many of these clubs were not built for the people who created the music. The most famous of them all was the Cotton Club, on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. It opened in 1923, and it was run by a man named Auni Madden, a bootlegger and gangster who had just been released from Sing Sing prison. The Cotton Club featured the most brilliant black performers in the country. Duke Ellington's orchestra was the house band, Cab Calloway performed there, Lena Horne got her start there. But the audience was white only. Black patrons were turned away at the door unless they happened to be famous enough to be recognized. The interior was decorated with plantation themes. Langston Hughes visited once and was disgusted. He later wrote that the Cotton Club treated black people like amusing animals in a zoo, and that it brought an influx of white visitors to Harlem who flooded the little bars and clubs where formerly only colored people laughed and sang. Not every club followed this model. Down the street, there was a place called Small's Paradise, and it was different. Ed Smalls, an African-American entrepreneur, opened it in 1925, and it was integrated from the start. The waiters danced the Charleston while delivering drinks. The club stayed open all night, offering breakfast dances at 6 in the morning with a full floor show. White and black musicians played together. White and black audiences sat together. It was one of the only places in New York where this was possible, and it became legendary precisely because of what it represented. What Small's Paradise proved was that when you removed the artificial barriers, when you let people just be people in a room together with great music, something almost alchemical happened. Walls came down. Not the physical kind, the kind inside people's heads. But the Harlem Renaissance, for all its brilliance, could not last forever. The Great Depression arrived. Race riots in 1935 and again in 1943 tore through the neighborhood. The big clubs moved downtown, closer to their white audiences. Harlem became a victim of its own success, with its music and its culture absorbed into Broadway shows and Hollywood films and radio programs, often without credit, often without compensation. The musicians who had built the scene watched as their innovations were packaged and sold to audiences who would never know their names. And yet, the music persisted. It always does. Because jazz is not just a genre, it is an instinct. And as America lurched toward the middle of the 20th century, that instinct was about to become something far more powerful than entertainment. The Second World War changed everything in ways that are still being felt today. Over 1 million Black Americans served in the armed forces during the conflict. They fought in segregated units, bled on the same battlefields as their white countrymen, and watched their friends die for a country that still considered them second-class citizens. When they came home, many of them returned to a nation that had not changed at all. Segregation was still the law in the South. In the North, it was the unspoken practice. Housing discrimination kept black families penned into specific neighborhoods. Employment discrimination kept them in the lowest-paying jobs, and the anger that had been building for decades found new fuel. In the world of jazz, something was shifting. The smooth, danceable swing music of the previous era was giving way to something more complex, more demanding, more deliberately confrontational. They called it bebop. Musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk were creating sounds that refused to be background music. Bebop was fast. It was intricate. It required your full attention. And that was the point. These musicians were not interested in being pleasant. They were interested in being brilliant. And if that made white audiences uncomfortable, so be it. There is a story about Charlie Parker that captures the spirit of this era perfectly. Parker, known universally as Bird, was the most gifted saxophonist of his generation, and perhaps any generation. His playing was so fast, so fluid, so impossibly creative that other musicians would literally stop and stare when he picked up his horn. He could take a simple melody and deconstruct it in real time, weaving through harmonic changes at speeds that seemed to defy physics. Parker was also a heroin addict, and his addiction would eventually kill him at the age of 34. But while he was alive, he was a force of nature. And his music was a declaration of intellectual independence. Bebop said, "This music is not here for your entertainment. It is here because it needs to exist. If you can keep up, welcome. If you cannot, that is your problem, not ours." Dizzy Gillespie brought a different energy. Where Parker was tortured and self-destructive, Gillespie was exuberant showmanship personified, with his puffed-out cheeks and his trademark bent trumpet. But behind the smile was a serious mind. Gillespie was deeply committed to dismantling racial barriers, and he used his fame as a platform. When the State Department asked him to tour the Middle East and South America as a cultural ambassador in the 1950s, he used the opportunity to pointedly remind his handlers that he was representing a country that did not treat him as an equal citizen. He was among the first jazz musicians to publicly integrate his bands, hiring white and Latin musicians at a time when mixed groups were controversial. The center of this revolution was a single block in Manhattan. 52nd Street between 5th and 6th Avenues was lined with small jazz clubs, one after another. The Onyx Club, the Three Deuces, the Famous Door, the Downbeat Club, Jimmy Ryan's. From the late 1930s through the 1950s, this stretch of pavement was the most important real estate in American music. Musicians from the Broadway theaters would finish their evening shows and head down to 52nd Street for late-night jam sessions. Black and white musicians played together on the same stages, drank at the same bars, shared the same cramped dressing rooms. In a city and a country that was still deeply segregated, 52nd Street was a crack in the wall. It was not perfect. Racism was still present, still lurking in the way club owners treated black performers, in the unequal pay, in the assumption that black musicians existed to serve white audiences. But the music itself was colorblind, and in those small, smoky rooms, something revolutionary was happening every single night. There is one moment from this era that captures the contradictions perfectly. In 1959, Miles Davis was headlining at Birdland, one of the most famous jazz clubs in New York, located just north of 52nd Street on Broadway. Davis was at the height of his powers. He had just released Kind of Blue, which would become the best-selling jazz album in history. One evening, during a break between sets, Davis stepped outside to get some air. He was standing on the sidewalk in front of the club that bore his music, dressed impeccably, when a white police officer approached him and told him to move along. Davis, understandably, refused. He was a performer at the club. He belonged there. The officer did not care. He beat Miles Davis on the sidewalk, in full view of passers-by, splitting his head open. Davis was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Photographs of the incident, showing one of the greatest musicians alive bleeding and being hauled away in handcuffs, were published in newspapers across the country. The message was clear. No matter how talented you were, no matter how much you had achieved, in the eyes of certain people, you were still just a black man who did not know his place. Davis never forgot that night. The scar on his head was visible for the rest of his life, and the cold, fierce pride that defined his public persona, the refusal to smile for anyone, the insistence on turning his back to audiences while he played, all of it can be traced, at least in part, to that sidewalk in front of Birdland. But we need to go back a few years to a woman whose contribution to this story predates almost everyone else. Billie Holiday was born Eleanora Fagan in Philadelphia in 1915, and her childhood was a catalog of horrors: poverty, abuse, time spent in a Catholic reform school. She was singing in Harlem nightclubs by the time she was a teenager, and her voice was unlike anything jazz had produced. It was not powerful in the conventional sense. It was fragile and knowing, full of smoke and hurt, and it had a way of bending a note that could make you feel things you did not have words for. In 1939, at Café Society in Greenwich Village, Holiday performed a song called "Strange Fruit." The lyrics were written by Abel Meeropol, a Jewish high school teacher from the Bronx, who had been inspired to write them after seeing a photograph of a lynching. The song described the bodies of lynched black men hanging from southern trees. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, the song said. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Holiday later said that the song reminded her of her father, who had died after being denied treatment at a white hospital. When she performed it, the room would go silent. The waitstaff was instructed to stop serving. The lights were dimmed until only a single spotlight remained on Holiday's face. When the last note faded, the spotlight went dark. There was no encore. The song was that devastating. Her record label, Columbia, refused to release it. They thought it was too provocative, too dangerous. A small independent label called Commodore Records eventually put it out, and it became one of the best-selling records in their catalog. Holiday performed Strange Fruit for the rest of her career, and it haunted her. She once said that singing it was like tearing open old wounds, but she kept singing it because she believed it was her duty. The song is often cited as one of the first major protest songs in American popular music, and its influence on the musicians who followed, from Nina Simone to Archie Shepp, cannot be overstated. And it was against this backdrop that the older generation of jazz musicians faced an impossible choice. Louis Armstrong, perhaps the most beloved entertainer in America, had spent decades smiling for white audiences, playing the genial ambassador of jazz. Duke Ellington, the most sophisticated composer the genre had ever produced, kept his politics largely to himself. Both men were later criticized harshly for their perceived silence, but the reality was more complicated. Armstrong, in 1957, stunned the nation when he publicly condemned President Eisenhower's handling of the Little Rock School integration crisis, calling the governor of Arkansas an uneducated plowboy and saying the government could go to hell. Ellington, as early as 1943, had presented a work called Black, Brown, and Beige at Carnegie Hall, a musical history of the black experience in America, reminding his audience that while the country fought for freedom abroad, it should not forget those denied freedom at home. These men were not silent, they were careful, and they paid a price for every word they said. But a new generation was arriving, and this generation had no interest in being careful. In 1958, a saxophonist named Sonny Rollins walked into a recording studio and created something that had never existed before. He called it the Freedom Suite. It was nearly 20 minutes long, which was extraordinary for a jazz recording at the time, and its message was unmistakable. Rollins later explained that he wanted to make a statement about the fact that jazz, the only uniquely American art form, had been created by Black Americans who were still denied basic human rights. The Freedom Suite was one of the very first jazz recordings to make an explicit political statement about civil rights. John Hassey, the curator of American music at the Smithsonian, would later describe it as singular, full of invention and surprises. There was nothing like it. Rollins had opened a door, and in the years that followed, musicians would walk through it carrying dynamite. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was not just a house of worship. It was the organizational headquarters of the civil rights movement in the city. Mass meetings were held there. Strategy sessions happened in its basement. The building itself was a symbol of Black resilience and community power in one of the most violently segregated cities in America. Birmingham's public safety commissioner, a man named Bull Connor, had already become infamous for turning fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters, many of them children. The city was a pressure cooker, and on that September morning in 1963, the pressure cooker exploded. The bombing was not an isolated incident. It was the 21st bombing targeting the Black community in Birmingham over the previous 8 years. The neighborhood where many Black families lived had earned the grim nickname of Dynamite Hill. But this bombing was different. 4 children were dead. The youngest was 11 years old. And the nation, Even those Americans who had been content to look away could no longer ignore what was happening. 3 days later, on September the 18th, Martin Luther King Jr. stood before an integrated crowd of 3,300 mourners at the 6th Avenue Baptist Church and delivered a eulogy for 3 of the 4 girls. His voice carried the weight of a man who understood that words were the only weapon he was willing to use. He told the congregation that these children did not die in vain, that God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. And then his tone shifted. The mourning gave way to something harder, something that sounded like steel being forged. He spoke of renewed determination. He spoke of the struggle ahead. And somewhere in New York, a quiet man with a saxophone was reading those words in a newspaper, and the rhythms of King's speech were already becoming something else inside his mind. John Coltrane was not the kind of person who gave interviews about politics. When pressed by the historian Frank Kofsky about attending a speech by Malcolm X, Coltrane would only say that he was quite impressed. That was it. He did not make declarations. He did not write manifestos. He was a deeply religious man who believed that people needed to love one another and that music could be a vehicle for that love. But the Birmingham bombing shook him to his core. It conflicted so fundamentally with everything he believed about humanity that he had to respond. And the only way he knew how to respond was through his horn. On November the 18th, 1963, just 64 days after the bombing and 4 days before the assassination of President Kennedy, Coltrane brought his quartet into Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. The musicians were McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums. Coltrane had a new piece. He did not tell them what it was called. He did not tell them what it was about. He simply began to play. The opening notes of the piece are slow, deliberate, heavy with sorrow. Coltrane's saxophone sounds like a human voice, like someone speaking through tears. The phrasing rises and falls with the cadence of a sermon. This was not accidental. Tyner would later explain what had happened. He said that Coltrane had read Martin Luther King's eulogy in the newspaper, the printed text of the funeral speech, and he had taken the rhythmic patterns of King's words and translated them into melody. The saxophone was not playing notes. It was speaking words that could not be spoken. And then, midway through the piece, something extraordinary happens. The mood shifts. Just as King's eulogy had transformed from mourning into a call for renewed determination, Coltrane's music does the same. Elvin Jones's drums, which had been barely audible, a whisper of brushes on cymbals, suddenly rise. The tempo lifts. The brushes become sticks. The whisper becomes a roar. It is the sound of grief turning into purpose, of sorrow becoming strength. The piece builds and builds, and when it finally subsides, you feel as though you have been through something. Not just listened to something, been through it. When the quartet performed the piece a few weeks later on Ralph Gleason's television show Jazz Casual, Gleason introduced it by name. He called it Alabama, and with that single word, everyone understood. Coltrane never publicly confirmed that the piece was a response to the bombing. He never had to. The music said everything he could not bring himself to say out loud. In 1964, he played 8 benefit concerts in support of Martin Luther King. He recorded tracks titled Reverend King and Backs Against the Wall. His album, Cosmic Music, was dedicated to King, but it was Alabama that became his most enduring political statement, precisely because it contained no words at all. Sometimes the deepest grief lives in places that language cannot reach. Coltrane found those places and made them sing. While Coltrane was a man who let his instrument do the talking, there was another musician who had no such restraint. And her name would become synonymous with the intersection of art and anger, beauty and rebellion, music and the unvarnished truth. She was born Eunice Kathleen Wayman on February the 21st, 1933, in a small town called Tryon in the mountains of North Carolina. She was the sixth of 8 children in a family that did not have much, but she had something that money could not buy. She could play the piano. Not just play it, command it. By the age of 4, she was performing. By the age of 6, she was accompanying her mother's church choir. Her talent was so obvious, so overwhelming, that the white women in her town took up a collection to pay for her music lessons with a local teacher named Muriel Mazanovich, who recognized almost immediately that this child was a prodigy. Eunice's dream was to become the first black classical concert pianist in America. She studied at Juilliard in New York on a scholarship. She practiced for hours every day, preparing for what she believed was her destiny. And then, in 1951, she applied to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. She was rejected. She believed, until the day she died, that she was turned away because of the color of her skin. Whether that was the explicit reason or not, the rejection devastated her. It shattered the path she had imagined for herself, and like so many devastating moments in history, it created something entirely new. To pay the bills, she started playing in bars and nightclubs in Atlantic City. She took the name Nina, a pet name a boyfriend had given her, and Simone, borrowed from the French actress Simone Signoret. Nina Simone was born not from ambition but from necessity. She played standards and jazz and blues, and her classical training bled through every note. There was a precision to her playing, a formal beauty, that set her apart from every other performer in every room she entered. She rose quickly. Record deals came. Audiences grew. Her version of I Loves You, Porgy, became a hit. By the early 1960s, Nina Simone was a star. But stardom for a black woman in America in the early 60s was a complicated thing. She was expected to perform, to entertain, to be grateful. She was not expected to have opinions. She was certainly not expected to be angry. And then came September 15th, 1963. When she heard about the Birmingham bombing, something inside Nina Simone snapped. She described the moment in vivid terms. She said she suddenly realized what it was to be black in America in 1963. She tried to build a gun. Her husband, Andy Stroud, stopped her. And in the space between the rage and the restraint, a song poured out of her. She said it erupted quicker than she could write it down. It came in a rush of fury, hatred, and determination. She called it Mississippi Goddam. The title alone was an act of war. In 1963, using the Lord's name in vain in a song title was almost unthinkable. Coupled with the name of a state that had become synonymous with racial terror, it was incendiary. Dick Gregory, the comedian and civil rights activist, later put it perfectly. He said, "If you look at all the suffering black folks went through, not one black man would dare say Mississippi Goddam. We all wanted to say it. She said it. That is the difference that set her aside from the rest of them." She debuted the song at a nightclub in Los Angeles about a week after she wrote it. She told the audience, "I mean every word of it." And then, in March of 1964, she performed it at Carnegie Hall. The room was filled with a mostly white audience who knew her for her elegant jazz standards and her tender ballads. They were not prepared for what came next. She sat down at the piano, looked out at the crowd, and said, "The name of this tune is Mississippi Goddam, and I mean every word of it." The audience laughed nervously. They thought she was joking. The music started, and it was bouncy, upbeat, almost cheerful. It sounded like a Broadway show tune. And that was the point, because the lyrics were anything but cheerful. "Alabama has gotten me so upset," she sang. "Tennessee made me lose my rest." And everybody knows about Mississippi Goddam. The contrast between the bright melody and the devastating words was deliberate, a musical mirror of America itself. A country that presented a smiling face to the world while hiding unspeakable cruelty behind the curtain. Halfway through the performance, she paused and addressed the audience again. Bet you thought I was kidding, did you not? This time, the laughter was muted. The room had gone cold. They understood now. This was not entertainment. This was testimony. The song was released as a single, and the backlash was immediate. Radio stations across the South refused to play it. Cases of the 45 records were returned to the label, snapped in half, the broken pieces stuffed back into the packaging. Promotional copies were destroyed. Simone later said on The Steve Allen Show that they received several letters where people had broken up the recording and sent it back to the recording company, telling them it was in bad taste. But for every record that was broken, 100 more were played in living rooms and dormitories and church basements, where people gathered to plan marches and sit-ins and voter registration drives. The song became an anthem, not the gentle kind, not a hymn of patience and hope, an anthem of fury and urgency. She sang, "They keep on saying go slow, but that is just the trouble. Do things gradually, and it would bring more tragedy. Why do you not see it? Why do you not feel it? I do not know. You do not have to live next to me. Just give me my equality." And then came Selma. In March of 1965, activists marching from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, were met with savage violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. State troopers attacked the marchers with clubs and tear gas. The images were broadcast on national television, and the country was horrified. When the marchers finally made it to Montgomery, a concert was held. 10,000 people gathered, packed so tightly that 57 of them fainted from the heat and the crush. And there, on a stage built from empty coffin crates, accompanied only by her guitarist, Nina Simone sang Mississippi Goddam. She changed the second line. Instead of Tennessee made me lose my rest, she sang Selma made me lose my rest. The crowd roared. She would continue updating the lyrics for years, swapping in the names of new tragedies as they arrived. Watts, Memphis. The song was a living document of American pain. Nina Simone was not just a performer during these years. She was a participant, a witness, and a weapon. She was friends with Martin Luther King, with James Baldwin, the writer whose searing prose about race in America made him one of the most important intellectuals of the century. She was close to Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, the first play by a black woman to be produced on Broadway. Hansberry was brilliant, politically radical, and dying. She and Simone would sit together for hours and talk about art and revolution and what it meant to be a black woman in America. When Hansberry died of cancer in 1965, at just 34 years old, Simone was devastated. The loss was personal, but it was also political. Hansberry had been one of the few people who could articulate, in words as precise as scalpels, the experience that Simone expressed through her music. She lived near Malcolm X in Mount Vernon, New York. She attended rallies and meetings. She marched. She used her fame, which was considerable, to draw attention to the cause, and she used her music to give the cause a voice that could not be silenced. Four Women, released in 1966, was a composition that told the stories of four black women across the spectrum of skin color and social experience. Aunt Sarah, the dark-skinned woman whose back was strong enough to carry a nation, but whose identity had been erased. Saffronia, the mixed-race daughter of violence. Sweet Thing, the woman whose beauty made her a commodity. And Peaches, whose anger had hardened into something dangerous. Each verse was a character study, each one shaped by the specific cruelties of racism, each one drawn from real experiences that Simone had witnessed or lived. The song was banned by several radio stations, not because of its language, but because of its content. The truth it told was considered too uncomfortable for mainstream consumption. And that, in a way, was its ultimate vindication. If the song could be played without causing discomfort, it would have failed. Its purpose was to make people uncomfortable. Its purpose was to force listeners to see what they preferred not to see. To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, released in 1969 with a title borrowed from Lorraine Hansberry, became a celebration of Black identity at a time when that identity was under constant assault. The song was gentle and encouraging, a balm for a community that had been battered by a decade of violence and loss. It was adopted by the Congress of Racial Equality as the Black National Anthem. Aretha Franklin recorded a version that became a hit, and for a moment it seemed as though Simone had found a way to be both a protest singer and a popular artist. But the moment did not last. The cost was enormous. Her career suffered, radio play dried up, bookings at major venues became scarce. She was considered too political, too angry, too difficult. She later said in an interview that she regretted writing Mississippi Goddam because of how much it hurt her career. "There is no reason to sing those songs," she told an interviewer in the 1980s. "Nothing is happening. There is no civil rights movement. Everybody is gone." The loneliness in those words is staggering. She eventually left the United States entirely, moving to Europe and then Africa. When asked why, she said simply, "I left this country because I did not like this country. I did not like what it was doing to my people, and I left." The jazz clubs of the 1950s and 60s were not just places where music happened. They were some of the most quietly radical spaces in America. In a country where Black and white Americans were forbidden by law and custom from eating together, sitting together, socializing together, the jazz club was a loophole, a small, smoke-filled, dimly lit loophole where the rules of the outside world did not entirely apply. Consider the Five-Spot Cafe on Cooper Square in New York. This was where Thelonious Monk held a legendary 6-month residency in 1957 that transformed his career and brought avant-garde jazz to a wider audience. It was also where, in 1963, the Congress of Racial Equality organized 2 benefit concerts to raise money for the civil rights movement. This was just weeks after the Birmingham church bombing, just weeks after Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. Musicians like Ben Webster, Al Cohn, and Zoot Sims performed. The audience was mixed, black and white, shoulder to shoulder, united by the music and by the cause. In most of America, this kind of gathering would have been impossible or illegal. In the Five-Spot, it was just another Tuesday night. Or consider Café Society, which opened on Sheridan Square in Greenwich Village in 1938. It was founded by a man named Barney Josephson, a Jewish businessman from Trenton, New Jersey, who had grown up appalled by the segregation he witnessed in New York's nightclubs. Josephson's club was advertised as the wrong place for the right people. It was the first racially integrated nightclub in the United States. Black and white performers shared the stage. Black and white audiences shared the tables. This was a radical act. Josephson faced threats from the mob, which controlled most of the city's nightclubs. He was targeted by police who objected to integration. But he had the support of Mayor LaGuardia, who was waging his own war against organized crime, and the club survived. Billie Holiday performed there on opening night and debuted Strange Fruit, the song about lynching that would become one of the most important recordings in American history. Count Basie played there, Nat King Cole, John Coltrane, Miles Davis. Café Society was proof that integration was not just possible but profitable, that mixed audiences would pay good money to hear good music in a space where they were treated like human beings. The concert promoter Norman Granz took this idea even further. Starting in the 1940s, Granz organized a touring series called Jazz at the Philharmonic, which brought top jazz musicians to concert halls across the country. Granz had one non-negotiable rule. The audience had to be integrated. If a venue refused to seat black and white patrons together, Granz would cancel the show. He did this repeatedly in the Jim Crow South, walking away from sold-out concerts because the venue would not remove the ropes separating white seats from colored seats. He fought with promoters, threatened lawsuits, and on more than one occasion simply packed up his musicians and left town. In Houston, Texas, Granz was arrested for allowing an integrated audience into a concert. In other cities, he faced threats of violence, but he never backed down. His philosophy was simple. Jazz was the product of Black American genius, and he would not allow it to be performed in front of audiences that treated Black Americans as subhuman. It cost him money. It cost him relationships. But he believed that the experience of sitting together, of sharing the visceral, physical experience of live jazz music, could do more to change hearts than any speech or pamphlet. And he was not wrong. Granz also used his position as a record producer to advance the cause. He founded the Verve Records label, which became home to many of the greatest jazz musicians of the era. And he insisted on fair contracts and decent treatment for his artists, at a time when the music industry routinely exploited black musicians. Ella Fitzgerald, who recorded extensively for Verve, credited Granz with transforming her career. He took her out of the nightclub circuit and put her in concert halls, insisting that she'd be treated with the same respect as any classical performer. When hotels refused to accommodate her because of her race, Granz would personally confront the management. On one occasion, he simply bought the hotel. Then there were the midnight jam sessions. After the official sets ended and the paying audience went home, musicians from different clubs would gather in back rooms and after-hours joints to play together. These sessions were raw and unstructured, driven by pure musicianship. A black saxophonist from Harlem might sit in with a white pianist from Brooklyn and a Puerto Rican drummer from the Bronx. The only credential that mattered was whether you could play. These sessions produced some of the most innovative music of the era, but their social significance was just as important. In those late-night hours, musicians were building relationships across racial lines that would have been unthinkable in the daylight world. They were creating a model for what America could be if it ever found the courage to let go of its obsession with the color of people's skin. There is a moment from 1963 that captures this beautifully. The jazz pianist Billy Taylor, a man of extraordinary elegance and intellect who would later become one of the great advocates for jazz education, had recorded a song called "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free." The melody was simple and hopeful, almost childlike in its yearning. "I wish I could share all the love that is in my heart," the lyrics said. "Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you would see and agree that every man should be free." A few years later, Nina Simone would cover the song and make it a civil rights anthem, but in its original form, it was a quiet prayer. The kind of song that a man might play late at night in an empty club after the audience had gone home, playing it for himself and for a world that was not yet ready to hear it. Now let me tell you about a man who did not have a diplomatic bone in his body. Charles Mingus was 6 feet tall, weighed well over 200 pounds, and carried himself with the barely contained energy of a man who might at any moment pick up a chair and throw it, which in fact he did on multiple occasions. He was a bass player, a composer, and one of the most volatile personalities in the history of jazz. He was also, without question, one of the most important musicians America ever produced. Mingus grew up in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, in a household that was mixed race and deeply complicated. He was light-skinned enough to be rejected by some black communities, and dark enough to be rejected by white ones. This experience of being caught between worlds, of belonging nowhere completely, fueled a rage that burned through everything he did. He was brilliant. He was impossible. He once punched his trombonist Jimmy Nepper in the mouth, breaking one of his teeth and damaging his ability to play. He was kicked out of clubs for berating audiences he felt were not listening properly. He once stopped a performance mid-song, walked to the microphone, and dressed down the crowd for talking over the music. "You would not pay to go to the opera and talk through the arias," he told them. "Why do you think you can talk through my music?" He was, by any measure, a difficulty man. But difficulty, in the context of American racism, was a form of survival. Mingus refused to fit into any category. He was not just a bass player, though he was one of the greatest who ever lived. He was a composer of staggering ambition, creating extended works that drew from gospel, blues, classical music, and the spontaneous energy of the jam session. His bands were workshops where the music was constantly evolving, where rehearsals could turn into shouting matches, and where the final product was always alive, always unpredictable, always on the edge of falling apart or achieving something magnificent. His bass playing itself was a physical act. He did not simply pluck the strings, he attacked them. His hands were enormous, and the sound he produced was thick and percussive and demanding. You could feel it in your chest. In 1959, Mingus recorded an album called Mingus that contained a track called Fables of Phoebus. The title referred to Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, who in 1957 had called in the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering the newly desegregated Central High School in Little Rock. Faubus had become a symbol of Southern resistance to integration, a small-minded bureaucrat who was willing to use military force against children to preserve white supremacy. Mingus wrote a song about him, and the song had lyrics, "O Lord, do not let them shoot us." The lyrics went, "O Lord, do not let them tar and feather us. O Lord, no more swastikas." The song was biting and satirical, mocking Phobos and the system he represented with a kind of gleeful, savage wit. But Columbia Records, Mingus's label, refused to release the version with the lyrics. They felt it was too incendiary, too dangerous. So the version that appeared on Mingus was an instrumental, the melody carrying all the mockery and the anger, but without the words. Mingus was furious. He took the song to another label, Candid Records, run by Nat Hentoff, the longtime Village Voice jazz critic and columnist. Hentoff had no such reservations. He released the full vocal version, including the lyrics, in 1960, and he released it alongside another landmark recording that same year, one that would become one of the most important political albums in jazz history. That album was We Insist, Freedom Now Sweet, by the drummer Max Roach. If there was a power couple in the world of protest jazz, it was Max Roach and the vocalist Abbey Lincoln. Roach was one of the most technically gifted drummers who ever lived, a pioneer of the bebop style who had played with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. He had been part of the revolution from the beginning, and by the late 1950s, he was increasingly frustrated that jazz musicians were not doing more to support the civil rights movement directly. He wanted to make a statement that could not be ignored. Lincoln was a singer and actress whose early career had been shaped by the entertainment industry's expectations for black women. She was beautiful, and record labels wanted her to be decorative. They gave her glamorous album covers and asked her to sing inoffensive standards. But Lincoln had a mind of her own, and when she met Max Roach, something ignited. Together, they decided to create a work that would shatter the pleasant facade that the music industry had built around jazz. They would tell the truth, and the truth would be brutal. We Insist. Freedom Now Sweet traces the black experience in America from the auction block to the present day. It opens with a piece called Driva Man, which evokes the horrors of plantation slavery. The rhythm is a relentless whip crack. The melody is a moan. And then the suite moves forward through time, through emancipation, through the broken promises of Reconstruction, through the long night of Jim Crow, arriving finally at the present moment, the early 1960s, when the movement for freedom was gaining momentum and the resistance to it was becoming more desperate and violent. The album's centerpiece is a piece called Triptych Prayer Protest Piece. It opens with Lincoln singing a melancholic improvised melody, her voice floating above a somber drum procession. Then the energy swells. Lincoln begins to wail. Not sing, wail. Her voice rises into something primal, something that sounds less like music and more like the accumulated anguish of generations being released all at once. Beneath her, Roach's drums build into an explosive solo, a cascade of sound that is at once chaotic and controlled. It builds and builds until it is almost unbearable, and then it drops back into silence. Lincoln's voice returns, but now it is exhausted, emptied out. She fades into quiet. The emotional journey is staggering. You feel as though you have lived through something: prayer, protest, peace. The entire arc of the civil rights movement compressed into a single piece of music. The album's cover was itself a political statement. It featured a photograph of three black men sitting at a lunch counter being served by a white man, an inversion of the sit-in protests that were happening across the South, where black customers were refused service at whites-only lunch counters. The image was provocative, and it was meant to be. Roach and Lincoln were not interested in subtlety. They wanted their audience to feel uncomfortable, to be confronted, to be changed. Art Blakey, another titan of jazz drumming, contributed his own musical response to the civil rights struggle. In 1964, his group, the Jazz Messengers, recorded a piece called The Freedom Rider, inspired by the Freedom Rides of 1961. The Freedom Rides were one of the most audacious and dangerous campaigns of the entire civil rights era. Black and white activists, many of them college students, rode interstate buses together through the Deep South to challenge segregated bus terminals. The law was on their side. The Supreme Court had already ruled that segregation in interstate travel was unconstitutional, but the law and reality were two very different things in the Jim Crow South. The Freedom Riders were met with extraordinary violence. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob of about 200 people surrounded a Greyhound bus, slashed its tires, and threw a firebomb through a broken window. The bus erupted in flames, and the passengers barely escaped before it was engulfed. The mob beat the riders as they stumbled out, choking on smoke. In Birmingham, Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor arranged for the Klan to have 15 uninterrupted minutes with the arriving riders before police would intervene. The beatings were savage. One rider, a white college professor named Jim Peck, required over 50 stitches to close the wounds on his face. In Montgomery, there was no police presence at all when the riders arrived, and the resulting melee left multiple people unconscious on the bus station floor. And yet, the riders kept coming. Every time one group was beaten or arrested, new volunteers replaced them. The rides continued for months until the Interstate Commerce Commission finally ordered the desegregation of all interstate travel facilities in September of 1961. Blakey's piece captured the relentless forward motion of that campaign, the determination that no amount of violence could extinguish. The music drove forward like a bus on a highway, unstoppable, heading somewhere that it had every right to go. These albums, these compositions, did something that speeches and marches alone could not. They brought the emotional reality of the civil rights struggle into record stores and living rooms across America. A white teenager in suburban Connecticut who had never been to Alabama, who had never seen a fire hose turned on children, could put Max Roach's album on the turntable and feel something. Not understand intellectually, but feel. And feeling is the precondition for empathy, and empathy is the precondition for change. As the 1960s wore on, the mood of the country darkened. The optimism of the early civil rights movement, the belief that nonviolent protest and moral persuasion could transform America, began to crack under the weight of relentless violence. Medgar Evers was assassinated in the driveway of his home in Jackson, Mississippi, in June of 1963, shot in the back by a white supremacist. John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas in November. Malcolm X was shot dead in the Audubon Ballroom in New York in February of 1965. And then, on April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He had gone to Memphis to support a sanitation workers' strike. He was 39 years old. That same year, Robert Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles. The body count was staggering. Cities burned. Watts in 1965, Newark and Detroit in 1967. After King's death, more than 100 cities erupted in flames. The National Guard was deployed. Curfews were imposed. America looked, from certain angles, like a country at war with itself. And for Black Americans who had been told to be patient, who had been told to go slow, who had been told that gradual progress was the only responsible path, the patience had simply run out. 3 days after King was killed, Nina Simone performed at the Westbury Music Fair on Long Island. She opened with a new song she had written that morning. It was called Why? The King of Love is Dead. Her voice was stripped bare. There was no anger in it this time, only grief so deep it seemed bottomless. The audience sat in stunned silence. Some wept openly. It was one of the most devastating performances of her career, and it captured the moment with unbearable precision. The King of Love was dead, and the music that had sustained the movement now had to find a way to express something that felt like the end of the world. In this atmosphere, a new movement emerged. Black Power rejected the integrationist philosophy of the early civil rights movement and embraced Black self-determination, Black pride, and, when necessary, self-defense. And the music changed with it. Free jazz, which had been developing since the late 1950s, became the sonic embodiment of this new sensibility. If bebop had been complex and demanding, free jazz was explosive and anarchic. It threw out the rules of harmony, melody, rhythm, and structure and replaced them with pure expression. Ornette Coleman had launched the movement with his 1960 album, appropriately titled Free Jazz, which featured two quartets improvising simultaneously for nearly 40 minutes. Cecil Taylor brought a percussive, almost violent approach to the piano that sounded less like jazz and more like a controlled demolition. Albert Ayler played saxophone with an intensity that could be physically painful to listen to, his tone raw and unfiltered, like a scream translated into music. For many Black musicians, free jazz was not just an aesthetic choice. It was a political one. The rejection of Western musical conventions was a rejection of white cultural dominance. The self-conscious creation of a new musical language, rooted in African rhythmic traditions and the spontaneous communal expression of the Black church, was an assertion of cultural independence. The writer Amiri Baraka, who championed the movement in his criticism and poetry, called it the changing same, a tradition of Black creative resistance that stretched from the spirituals of enslavement through the blues, through jazz, and into this fierce new sound. It was the same impulse, the same need to create beauty and meaning in the face of destruction, dressed in new clothes for a new era. Some musicians, like Archie Shepp, made the connection between their music and their politics explicit. Shepp, who grew up in the gang-ridden streets of Philadelphia, knew violence intimately. His cousin, a boy named Robert Mincer, who went by the nickname Steam, was stabbed to death in a street fight at the age of 15. Shepp later wrote a composition in his memory, a somber waltz that he performed for the rest of his career. He learned about racial injustice not from books, but from listening to his father and their upstairs neighbor debate politics every weekend in their apartment. He wrote a paper about prejudice in the 3rd grade. His teacher was shocked. "Where did you learn about racism?" she asked him, apparently not considering that the child standing before her was a victim of it. Shepp joined Cecil Taylor's band straight out of college and was drawn into the world of free jazz, which he described as a complete transformation of his understanding of music. He became one of the most outspoken voices in the movement. His 1965 album Fire Music contained a piece called Malcolm, Malcolm Semper Malcolm, a searing tribute to Malcolm X that served as a musical declaration of resistance. The album's liner notes were as provocative as the music. Shep declared that jazz was born out of the enslavement of his people, and that playing it was an act of liberation. Shep did not mince words. He once said, "Jazz is a music itself born out of oppression, born out of the enslavement of my people." He saw his music as a continuation of the freedom struggle by other means. His album, Attica Blues, released in 1972, was inspired by the Attica prison uprising and its brutal suppression by New York state troopers. And it remains one of the most powerful musical statements about incarceration and systemic racism ever recorded. And then there was Sun Ra, who took the entire question of black liberation and projected it into outer space. Born Herman Poole Blount in Birmingham, Alabama, the very city where 4 girls would one day be killed in a church basement, Sun Ra claimed to have been transported to Saturn, where aliens told him that the world was going to end and that he should prepare people through music. He assembled a large ensemble called the Orchestra, dressed them in ancient Egyptian costumes and space-age headgear, and created music that blended jazz, electronic sounds, chanting, and theatrical spectacle. If you had walked into a Sun Ra concert without any context, you might have thought you had stumbled into a religious ceremony from another civilization. It was strange and otherworldly and utterly original, and beneath the cosmic imagery was a deeply serious philosophical point. If America would not accept black people as citizens, perhaps the answer was not to fight for a seat at the American table, but to build an entirely new table, somewhere else, entirely. Sun Ra once said, "I am not a part of this world. I am a part of space." This was not insanity. It was a strategy. By refusing to accept the terms of the debate, by insisting that black people were not merely Americans fighting for inclusion, but cosmic beings with a heritage that stretched back to the dawn of civilization, Sun Ra was doing something profoundly liberating. He was freeing the imagination. And in a country that had spent centuries telling black people what they could not be, freeing the imagination was perhaps the most radical act of all. Sun Ra's Afrofuturism, the idea that black identity could be reimagined through the lens of science fiction and ancient African civilizations, would influence generations of artists. You can trace a direct line from the orchestra to Parliament Funkadelic and George Clinton's Mothership to Janelle Monáe's conceptual albums about android identity, to the visual language of the film Black Panther. Sun Ra showed that protest did not have to look like a march or sound like a speech. It could look like Saturn and sound like the future. In July of 1969, the year that American astronauts walked on the moon, another kind of gathering was happening on the other side of the world. The first Pan-African Cultural Festival was held in Algiers, Algeria, bringing together artists, activists, and revolutionaries from across the African continent and the African diaspora. Nina Simone performed. Archie Shep performed. The South African trumpeter Hugh Masekela, who had fled apartheid, performed. The speeches were given by Stokely Carmichael, the Trinidadian-born activist who had coined the term Black Power, and by Amilcar Cabral, the revolutionary leader of Guinea-Bissau's independence movement. Maya Angelou was there. It was a convergence of art and politics on a global scale, and jazz was at the very heart of it. These musicians were no longer fighting just for civil rights in America. They were connecting the black freedom struggle to the worldwide movement against colonialism and oppression. The music had gone global. The free jazz movement was divisive. Many jazz fans and critics hated it. They found it chaotic, unlistenable, self-indulgent. Some black listeners felt the same way, preferring the soulful accessibility of artists like Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder to the challenging abstractions of Ornette Coleman. But what free jazz accomplished perhaps more than any other musical movement of its era was to make the statement that black artistic expression did not need white approval to be valid. That was, in itself, a revolutionary act. And at the center of this whirlwind, standing at the intersection of spiritual depth and musical innovation, was John Coltrane. In December of 1964, 1 year after Alabama, Coltrane gathered his quartet at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in New Jersey and recorded what many consider the greatest jazz album ever made. A Love Supreme was a four-part suite: acknowledgement, resolution, pursuance, psalm. Together they formed a musical prayer, a journey from spiritual searching to ecstatic communion. The album was simultaneously a confession and a statement of faith. It was Coltrane's offering to a higher power, his way of expressing gratitude for being delivered from the addiction that had nearly destroyed him in the 1950s. He had gone through a kind of death and rebirth, and A Love Supreme was the sound of the rebirth. The album opens with a gong and a few notes on the bass, and then Coltrane enters on tenor saxophone with a motif that he repeats in different keys, chanting the words "A Love Supreme" through his horn. The effect is hypnotic. It pulls you in and holds you there. As the suite progresses, the music grows more intense, more searching, more urgent. The final movement, Psalm, is essentially a musical recitation of a poem that Coltrane had written, a prayer of gratitude that he plays on his saxophone without ever speaking a word. The rhythms of his playing match the rhythms of the written text so precisely that you can follow along, word for word, if you have the poem in front of you. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of musical expression ever recorded. But A Love Supreme was also in its own way a civil rights document. Its insistence on the dignity of the individual soul, its belief that human beings are capable of transcendence, its refusal to accept the limitations that the world imposes. These were the same principles that animated the freedom movement. Coltrane played benefit concerts for civil rights organizations throughout the mid-1960s. He supported groups financially and used his stature to bring attention to the cause. In 1964 alone, he played 8 concerts to raise money for Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was not a man of many words in public, but his generosity was well known among the people who worked in the movement. He gave his time and his talent freely, believing that music was not just a profession but a calling, and that calling included the obligation to serve others. In an interview with the historian Frank Kofsky in the summer of 1966, Coltrane was asked about the power of music to promote social change. His answer was characteristically measured. He said, "I think music is an instrument. It can create the initial thought patterns that can change the thinking of the people." And when he said the word instrument, he meant it in both senses. The saxophone was an instrument, yes, but so was the act of creating beauty in a world that seemed intent on producing only ugliness. But his deepest contribution was the music itself. When he played A Love Supreme or Alabama or Ascension, he was creating a space where the listener could experience something beyond the everyday horror of racism and violence. He was offering what King had called the beloved community, not as a political program, but as a sonic reality. For the duration of a Coltrane performance, the world was as it should be. And maybe if enough people experienced that world, they would fight to make it real. Coltrane died on July the 17th, 1967, of liver cancer. He was 40 years old. The loss was devastating, not just to the jazz world, but to the broader cultural landscape. He had accomplished more in his short life than most musicians could achieve in 3 lifetimes, and he was gone before the decade was out. In 1964, something happened that connected the world of jazz to the civil rights movement in a way that is sometimes overlooked. Martin Luther King Jr. was invited to deliver the opening address at the Berlin Jazz Festival. Yes, that Martin Luther King at a jazz festival in Berlin, and his words, written specifically for this occasion, remain one of the most eloquent statements ever made about the relationship between jazz and freedom. King wrote, "Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music. It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It has calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. He called jazz the voice of the people who are too weary of struggle to speak. He said that jazz called Americans to engage with their national identity, that it gave expression to the beauty of democracy and of personal freedom, and of choosing to embrace the humanity of all types of people. Coming from a man who had been beaten, jailed, stabbed, and whose home had been firebombed, these words carried extraordinary weight. King understood something that is easy to miss if you think of music as merely entertainment. He understood that music has the power to change the way people feel about themselves and about each other, that a saxophone solo could reach places that a legal brief could not, that a protest song sung on a stage made of coffin crates in Montgomery, Alabama, could do what 1,000 speeches could not. It could make you feel the injustice in your own body. And once you feel it, you cannot unfeel it. The musicians who made this music paid dearly for it. Nina Simone lost her career, her country, and much of her peace of mind. After leaving the United States, she drifted through Barbados, Liberia, Switzerland, England, and finally France. She struggled with bipolar disorder, which was largely untreated for much of her life. Her personal relationships were often turbulent. She had been physically abused by her manager and husband, Andy Stroud, the same man who had stopped her from building that gun. In her later years, she could be erratic on stage, sometimes stopping mid-performance to berate an audience member, sometimes playing with a brilliance that reminded everyone of the genius they were in the presence of. She died in Carry-le-Rouet, a small town on the coast of southern France, on April the 21st, 2003. She was 70 years old. It was only in the years after her death that the world began to reckon with the magnitude of her contribution. Documentaries were made. Her music was rediscovered by a new generation. In 2019, Mississippi Goddam was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Recording Registry, recognized as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. It took more than 50 years for the song to receive that honor. One wonders what Nina would have said about that. Coltrane died young, his body worn out by years of substance abuse, followed by years of relentless creative output. He had overcome heroin and alcohol addiction in the late 1950s, a transformation he attributed to a spiritual awakening, but the damage had been done. Liver cancer took him on July the 17th, 1967. He was 40 years old. In those last years, his music had grown increasingly abstract and intense, pushing so far beyond conventional jazz that some listeners could not follow. But those who stayed with him, who listened deeply, found something transcendent in the noise. His final recordings have the quality of a man trying to say everything he has ever felt, all at once, before the music stops. Charles Mingus spent his later years battling amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the disease also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, which gradually paralyzed his body. He composed his final works from a wheelchair, dictating the notes he could no longer play. He died in Mexico in 1979. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges River in India, a final journey for a man who had never stopped searching for somewhere he belonged. Max Roach continued to perform and teach for decades, becoming a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and mentoring generations of young musicians. He remained politically active throughout his life, never losing the fire that had produced We Insist. He died in 2007 at the age of 83. Abbey Lincoln, who had poured her soul into that astonishing wail on the Freedom Now suite, stepped away from music for nearly a decade in the 1970s. When she returned, her voice had changed. The rage had softened into something wiser, more reflective. She made some of the most beautiful recordings of her career in her later years, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had lived through. She died in 2010, and yet, the music endures. It has to, because the struggle it documented is not over. In 1969, Nina Simone released a song called To Be Young, Gifted and Black. The title came from her friend Lorraine Hansberry, who had died of cancer in 1965 at just 34 years old. Hansberry had been working on a memoir with that title, and Simone took the phrase and turned it into a hymn of affirmation for a generation of young Black Americans who had been told in 1,000 different ways that they were less than. The song was gentle and encouraging, a stark contrast to the fury of Mississippi Goddam. It was a mother's voice telling her children that they mattered, that they were beautiful, that the world was waiting for them. The song became an anthem, not of protest but of possibility, and its spirit echoed forward through the decades. You can hear it in the spoken word poetry of Gil Scott-Heron, who merged jazz with political commentary in the early 1970s. Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, released in 1971, was a direct descendant of the protest jazz tradition, its rhythms rooted in the same soil that had nourished Mingus and Roach and Simone. Scott-Heron understood that the line between jazz and social commentary was not a line at all. It was a continuation. You can hear the legacy in the sampling of jazz recordings by hip-hop producers in the 1980s and 90s. A Tribe Called Quest built entire albums around jazz samples, recognizing that the music of Coltrane and Mingus and Simone contained emotional truths that were still relevant, still necessary. Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly, released in 2015, was a full-scale jazz rap fusion that grappled with the same questions of Black identity and systemic injustice that had consumed Nina Simone 50 years earlier. The album featured the saxophonist Kamasi Washington, whose own work has been described as a continuation of the spiritual jazz tradition that Coltrane pioneered. You can hear it in the work of Esperanza Spalding, a bassist and vocalist who carries the tradition forward while addressing the realities of a new century. In the poetry of Amiri Baraka, who spent decades writing about jazz as a political force. In the music of Wynton Marsalis, who has dedicated much of his career to preserving and teaching the history of jazz as a civil rights document. And you can hear it in the streets when Black Lives Matter protesters marched through American cities in 22, after the killing of George Floyd. Many of them carried signs and chanted slogans, but some of them also played music. Trumpets and saxophones appeared in crowds. Someone would start playing Alabama by Coltrane, and people who had never heard the song before would stop and listen and feel something move inside them. The piece that Coltrane had recorded in a New Jersey studio in 1963, translating the rhythms of a funeral speech for 4 murdered children, was still doing its work more than 50 years later, still mourning, still demanding, still refusing to accept that this is the best we can do. The story of jazz and the civil rights movement is not a story with a neat ending. It is a story about what happens when human beings are pushed to the limits of their endurance and choose to create rather than destroy. It is about musicians who understood that their instruments were weapons, that a melody could be a manifesto, that improvisation, the act of making something beautiful out of nothing, in real time without a safety net, was itself a form of freedom. It is about Billie Holiday standing on a stage in 1939, singing about the strange fruit hanging from southern trees, knowing that the song could end her career. It is about Sonny Rollins walking into a studio in 1958 and declaring, through his saxophone, that the country that created jazz owed a debt to the people who created it. It is about Charles Mingus refusing to let Columbia Records silence his mockery of a segregationist governor. It is about Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln compressing the entire Black experience into a 37-minute album that still has the power to make you weep. It is about John Coltrane sitting in a studio in New Jersey 4 days before the president would be killed, playing the cadences of a funeral eulogy for 4 little girls, and finding in those cadences a reason to keep going. It is about Nina Simone, who wanted to build a gun and built a song instead. These musicians did not set out to change the world. Most of them just wanted to play. But the world they lived in would not let them just play. It demanded something more, and they gave it. They gave everything they had. They played until their fingers bled. They sang until their voices cracked. They composed music that was so honest, so raw, so uncompromisingly truthful that it could not be ignored. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. Late at night when the world is quiet, put on Coltrane's Alabama. Close your eyes. Listen to the saxophone tracing the rhythms of a speech that was given at the funeral of 4 children who should have grown up to be old women. Listen to the drums rise from a whisper to a roar. Feel the shift from mourning to determination. That is what jazz gave the civil rights movement. Not just a soundtrack, not just entertainment for rallies and marches. It gave the movement a voice that could reach beyond language, beyond politics, beyond the limitations of the spoken word. It gave the movement a way to express the inexpressible, the grief that is too deep for tears, the anger that is too vast for shouting, the hope that persists even when every rational reason for hope has been extinguished. There is something about instrumental music, about a saxophone or a piano or a set of drums, speaking without words, that bypasses the defenses we build around ourselves. You can argue with a speech, you can dismiss a slogan, you can close your eyes to a photograph, but you cannot close your ears to Coltrane's Alabama and remain unchanged. The sound enters you. It moves through the walls you have built and finds the tender place beneath, the place where you are capable of empathy, capable of feeling what another human being feels. That is the power of music. That is what these musicians understood. And that is why their work endures long after the specific political battles they were fighting have been won or lost or transformed into something new. The jazz musicians of the civil rights era did not save the world. They were the first to acknowledge that. Nina Simone, in her darker moments, wondered whether any of it had mattered. The laws changed, yes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, these were monumental achievements. But the deeper transformation, the change in hearts and minds that King had dreamed of, that Coltrane had prayed for, that Simone had raged toward, that transformation remains unfinished. The musicians knew this. They knew that art alone could not dismantle a system built over centuries. But they also knew that without art, without the ability to feel and to imagine and to be moved, no system could ever be dismantled at all. Martin Luther King said it best. The music strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. These stories matter, and so does keeping them alive. If this one meant something to you, a like and a subscribe go a long way in helping more people find this channel. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. What topic should we explore next? Until then, rest well, sleep peacefully, and remember, the music never stops. It just waits for someone to listen. Good night, friends.